immigration. It's a topic that seems like it always gets people fired up.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to keep things level-headed here. Focus on the facts and figures, What we're looking at today is Donald Trump's mass deportation plan. It's a big part of his campaign for 2024.
Yeah, it's definitely raising a lot of questions. And, honestly, some eyebrows, too. The first thing that hits you is just the sheer size of it. Trump's talking about deporting an estimated 13 million undocumented immigrants.
13 million? That's a hard number to even grasp. I mean, to give our listeners a sense of scale,
It's about 4% of everyone in the U.S. And another comparison to think about, it's way more than everyone in all the prisons and jails in the country combined. So, yeah, the logistics are mind-boggling.
I mean, a plan this big has got to come with a big price tag, too.
Oh, absolutely. But even figuring out the cost is tricky. There are all these different estimates out there, and that kind of tells you something right there.
So let's look at the numbers. What are the experts saying?
Well, on the high end, you've got groups like the American Immigration Council. They're projecting it could cost $315 billion over 10 years.
$315 billion. Wow. To put that in perspective for our listeners, that's more than the entire budget of most government agencies.
It's a massive number for sure. And even if you look at the more conservative estimates, you're still talking $162 billion. So no matter how you slice it, this would be a huge financial undertaking.
Why is there such a big difference between those high and low estimates, though? I mean, what's driving that?
It comes down to the assumptions in the models. Things like, how efficiently could they actually carry out the deportations? How much cooperation would there be between different agencies? And then there's a whole bunch of logistical factors, too.
Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of argument, that this plan actually happens. What would deporting millions of people actually look like? What are the steps involved?
Well, the deportation process itself has a lot of layers, and each stage comes with its own challenges.
All right, let's break it down step by step. Where does it all start?
It all begins with arrests. And it's important to make a distinction here between arresting people who are already in custody versus those who are at large.
So someone already in jail or prison versus someone living in the community.
Exactly. Arresting people who are already in custody is pretty straightforward. But the core of Trump's plan depends on those at-large arrests. And those are much more complex, and they take a lot more resources.
I see. Can you explain why? What makes those at-large arrests so much harder?
Well, think about it. To arrest someone who is not already locked up, you often need multiple IC agents. You need surveillance operations, maybe even stakeouts. It's a whole lot more involved.
So we're talking about a massive expansion of ICE then? Like they'd need tons of new agents and resources.
Potentially, yeah. Some projections say IC would have to hire more than 30,000 new agents and staff, which would make them the biggest law enforcement agency in the whole federal government.
Wow. So, okay, you've made the arrest. What happens next in this process?
The next step is detention. And I should point out, this is the most expensive part of the whole deportation process.
How expensive are we talking? Give us an idea what this would cost.
It costs roughly $200 per person per day to hold someone in ICE custody.
And if we're talking about potentially detaining billions of people?
Yeah, the cost gets out of control really fast. And that brings us to another big hurdle: capacity. The detention centers we have now just don't have the space to hold an estimated 13 million undocumented immigrants.
So where would they put all these people? What's the plan for handling that many detainees?
That's the big question, isn't it? One suggestion from the American Immigration Council is that ICE would need to build hundreds of temporary soft-sided facilities every year. You know, those tent-like structures you see near the border.
I'm curious to know what our listeners think about this. How do we balance the need for immigration enforcement with the economic and social realities of deporting this many people? Let us know in the comments. And hey, if you're finding this conversation helpful, give us a like. It really helps more people find these important discussions. Now back to the issue of detention facilities.
Those tent facilities are one option for sure, but they do raise concerns about, treating people humanely. There's also the possibility of using electronic monitoring. It's cheaper than actually locking people up. Only costs about $4 a day per person.
That's still a lot of money, though, when you're talking about millions of people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even get into the issue of separating families and what that does to kids.
No, it doesn't. Detaining families, especially ones with young children. It makes everything even more complicated and expensive.
Why is that? What makes family detention so different?
Well, the government is legally obligated to make sure kids in detention are taken care of, They need access to child welfare workers, doctors, schools. And the facilities have to meet certain standards. It's not just about putting people in a building and forgetting about them.
So it's not just a logistical nightmare. It's an ethical one, too. Okay. So we've got the arrests and the detentions. What's the next hurdle in this whole deportation process?
The next big step is legal processing. And this is where things can really bog down. Each case needs lawyers, judges, courtrooms. The whole system is already overloaded as it is.
So if you suddenly dump a ton of deportation cases on top of that, the court system would just collapse, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Some estimates say we'd need thousands more immigration judges in courtrooms, which would add another huge chunk of change to this already expensive plan.
Are there any ideas out there for dealing with that? How could they possibly handle that many cases?
Well, one idea that's been floated is using those tent courts. They've used them before, like back in 2019 with the migrant protection protocols, where immigrants were sent back to Mexico to wait for their hearings in these temporary courts set up near the border.
So the idea is to speed things up.
Yeah.
Even if it means cutting corners on due process and legal rights.
Yeah, that's one of the big concerns critics have. They're worried about whether it's fair, whether people have access to lawyers, whether these proceedings can really be considered just...
This whole plan just seems to be full of logistical and ethical problems. So let's say for a minute that we get past the arrests, the detentions, the legal battles. What's the last step in actually getting millions of people out of the country?
The final stage, and it's a massive one, is removal. Actually, physically transporting people out of the U.S. Just imagine the logistics of coordinating thousands of flights every year, especially for people who aren't from Mexico or Canada.
Yeah, that sounds like a complete nightmare, even if you don't think about the human cost. And I bet the price tag is through the roof.
It is. The average ICE removal flight costs about $117,000 per hour. And if the government has to rely on private companies for planes and pilots, those costs could go way up.
So how could they even pay for this? Are there any ways to cut costs in this removal stage?
Well, they've talked about using government planes that already exist, like the ones used by the Justice Department or the Marshal Service to try to save some money. But even then, it's still a gigantic undertaking.
We're talking about something on a scale that's never been done before in this country. And that brings up a huge question. How is Trump going to pay for all of this? He's been pretty vague about the details so far.
He has, yeah. He said there's no price tag for his plan, which, has people wondering if it's even possible logistically and financially.
It makes you wonder where the money's coming from. And if Congress would even go for it, especially with how close the numbers are in both the House and the Senate.
Right. Even if Trump gets Congress to sign off on it, and that's a big if. Finding the money for something this big would be a major hurdle. They'd probably have to cut other programs way back or raise taxes a lot.
And that's just the direct cost. We haven't even talked about the indirect costs, how this could ripple through the whole economy and society.
Exactly. Mass deportations could lead to shortages of workers in important industries. Supply chains could get messed up. Overall economic output could go down. It could have a huge impact.
And then there's the human side of things. Separating families, the effects on communities, the toll it takes on people who are being targeted for deportation. Those are all things we can't just ignore.
Absolutely. We're talking about people's lives here, not just numbers on a balance sheet.
It's complicated. We've laid out the costs and the logistics of mass deportation. But what about the bigger picture? What kind of impact could this have on American society as a whole?
I don't think you can really overstate how big of an impact this could have. We've seen it happen again and again throughout history. Whenever you have these huge changes in a society's makeup, it can have these massive effects. And a lot of times you just can't predict what they'll be.
So it's not just about the economy or political arguments. We're talking about something that could change what it means to be American.
Exactly. It's about communities, families, the whole cultural landscape of the country. Something like this on this scale. It would reshape the American experience in ways we can't even imagine right now.
It makes you ask this basic question. Who are we as a country? What do we stand for? What are our priorities? How do we define what it means to be American?
Those are the real questions at the heart of this whole debate. And there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. This goes way beyond just politics and what party you belong to. It's about these really tough moral and societal questions.
It's easy to get caught up in the details, the logistics, the money, the political back and forth. But we can't forget that there are real people involved in all of this.
Exactly. Every statistic, every policy proposal, it represents real people whose lives would be turned upside down by something this big.
It's a lot to think about. We've talked about the potential costs and the logistical hurdles of mass deportation, but it seems like the human cost is the hardest thing to measure.
It really is. It's a cost that we have to think about very carefully. It goes beyond just dollars and cents or political wins and losses. It's about the impact on individuals, families, communities.
This has been a really insightful discussion. It feels like we've only just started to explore a very complex issue.
We have. And it's an issue that deserves a lot more attention and careful thought.
Absolutely. Well, if you found this conversation insightful, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe for more deep dives just like this one. We're always looking at the most important issues and giving you the information and different perspectives to help you navigate this complicated world.
And as we wrap up today, we'll leave you with this thought. What do you think is the best way forward for dealing with immigration? How do we uphold our laws but also stay true to our values as a nation? It's a tough question, but it's one that we all need to grapple with.